Pooh Shiesty just sent shockwaves through the hip-hop world, and the fallout is already getting ugly. In a move nobody saw coming, Shiesty has reportedly exposed Gucci Mane in a way that's forcing fans, insiders, and industry veterans to ask some very uncomfortable questions. What started as quiet tension behind the scenes has now exploded into public conversation, and the energy around this situation feels different, heavier, more serious, and far more personal than typical rap drama. This isn't just another internet rumor. This feels like a line has been crossed. For years, Gucci Mane has been seen as a gatekeeper, a kingmaker, and a respected figure in the rap industry. His influence runs deep, and his connections stretch far beyond music. That's why Pooh Shiesty speaking out has hit so hard. Fans are trying to piece together what really happened, why now, and what pushed Shiesty to finally break his silence. The timing alone has raised eyebrows, with many believing there's far more going on behind closed doors than anyone previously realized. Social media erupted almost instantly. Clips, quotes, and screenshots began circulating, each one adding fuel to the fire. Some fans are siding with Pooh Shiesty, claiming he's finally telling his truth after being held back for too long. Others are defending Gucci Mane, arguing that there's history, loyalty, and context being ignored. But regardless of where people stand, one thing is clear. This situation has cracked open a conversation the industry wasn't ready for. What makes this moment even more intense is what's at stake. Careers, reputations, and long-standing alliances could all be affected depending on how this unfolds. When an artist like Pooh Shiesty challenges someone with Gucci Mane's level of power, it's never just about personal grievances. It's about control, influence, and who really holds power behind the scenes. Every word being analyzed, every reaction being watched, and every silence being questioned. This isn't a situation that's going to disappear overnight. The tension is building, the pressure is rising, and the hip-hop community is bracing for what comes next. Whether this turns into direct responses, industry backlash, or even deeper revelations, one thing is certain: the fallout from this exposure is serious. And as more details come to light, this story could change how fans see both Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane forever. The moment Pooh Shiesty's words began circulating, the energy around his name shifted instantly. What once felt like quiet tension turned into open speculation, and fans started connecting dots that had been ignored for years. People weren't just reacting to what was said, they were reacting to what it implied. The idea that someone once closely associated with Gucci Mane would speak out suggested deeper fractures behind the scenes. For many listeners, this wasn't random frustration spilling out. It felt like a long-brewing situation finally reaching its breaking point. For years, Gucci Mane had been viewed as a mentor figure, someone who built artists up and gave them platforms when others wouldn't. That reputation made the exposure hit even harder. If there was truth behind Pooh Shiesty's claims, it raised uncomfortable questions about loyalty, power, and the price artists pay to rise in the industry. Fans began revisiting old interviews, lyrics, and public appearances, searching for moments that now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Things that once looked like support suddenly felt transactional, and praise started sounding like control when viewed through a different lens. Pooh Shiesty's tone mattered just as much as the message. There was no celebratory energy, no attempt to capitalize on shock value. Instead, his words carried frustration and exhaustion, the kind that comes from feeling unheard or misrepresented for too long. That's what made people listen. This didn't sound like clout chasing. It sounded like someone finally deciding they had nothing left to lose. That perception alone shifted public opinion, pushing many fans to take his side before Gucci Mane had even responded. Behind the scenes, industry insiders reportedly weren't surprised. Rumors had circulated for months about tension within camps, disagreements over decisions, and resentment building quietly. Artists close to both sides allegedly knew things were strained, but no one expected it to surface so publicly. When it did, it exposed how fragile industry alliances can be once money, fame, and control enter the picture. Loyalty in hip-hop has always been tested, But this situation highlighted how quickly mentorship can turn into conflict when expectations aren't aligned. Social media became the battleground almost immediately. Supporters flooded comment sections, calling Pooh Shiesty brave for speaking up. Others urged caution, reminding fans that public narratives rarely tell the full story. Still, the silence from Gucci Mane's side only intensified speculation. In hip-hop culture, silence can be powerful, but it can also be interpreted as avoidance. Every hour without a response allowed the narrative to grow in directions that were impossible to control. What made the fallout feel serious wasn't just the exposure itself, but the implications. If Pooh Shiesty's claims hinted at larger patterns, it could force the industry to look inward. Fans started questioning how many other artists felt similarly but never spoke out. The conversation shifted from one disagreement to a broader discussion about power dynamics, contracts, and control in rap. That shift made the story bigger than two names. It made it about the system itself. As pressure mounted, people began anticipating what would come next. Would Gucci Mane respond directly, or would he let his legacy speak for itself? Would other artists step forward, or would fear keep them silent? The uncertainty created tension that felt heavy, almost uncomfortable. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was confrontation. And once a situation reaches that point, there's no going back to how things were before. By the end of part one thing was clear. Pooh Shiesty had cracked something open that couldn't be closed again. Whether intentional or not, his exposure forced conversations that the industry preferred to keep private. The fallout wasn't just serious, it was inevitable. And with both sides now under intense scrutiny, the next move would determine whether this situation exploded into full-blown conflict or quietly reshaped reputations behind the scenes. As the conversation continued to spiral, the silence from Gucci Mane's camp became the loudest sound in the room. Fans refreshed timelines constantly, waiting for a statement, a post, or even a subtle response that could shift the narrative. In hip-hop, timing is everything, and the longer the pause lasted, the more space it created for speculation to grow. People began filling in the gaps themselves, crafting theories, timelines, and interpretations that painted the situation in increasingly dramatic ways. What started as a single exposure was now evolving into a full-blown public reckoning. Behind the scenes, the pressure was undeniable. Industry insiders began hinting that conversations were happening privately, with advisors weighing the risks of responding versus staying silent. For someone with Gucci Mane's legacy, any reaction carried consequences. A defensive response could add fuel to the fire, while silence risked allowing Pooh Shiesty's narrative to become the accepted truth. This delicate balance highlighted how power works in the industry. Influence doesn't always come from speaking first, but from choosing the right moment to speak at all. Meanwhile, Pooh Shiesty's supporters grew louder. Fans argued that his willingness to speak up showed courage, especially given the power imbalance between an established figure and a younger artist. Many pointed out how often emerging rappers are expected to remain loyal and quiet, even when they feel wronged. That sentiment resonated deeply, turning this situation into a symbol of something bigger than personal conflict. It became about artists finding their voices and pushing back against structures they believe limit their growth or autonomy. As the debate intensified, older moments from both artists' histories were dragged back into the spotlight. Past collaborations were re-examined, lyrics were reinterpreted, and interviews took on new meaning. Lines that once sounded like praise were now viewed as subtle power plays. Moments of support were questioned, and fans wondered whether loyalty had ever truly been mutual. This kind of retrospective analysis fueled the fire further, creating a sense that the exposure wasn't sudden, but rather the culmination of years of quiet tension. The industry reaction was noticeably cautious. Few artists spoke publicly, choosing instead to watch from a distance. That silence spoke volumes. It suggested fear of taking sides, of damaging relationships, or becoming the next name dragged into the controversy. Hip-hop has always valued loyalty, but it also operates on alliances and politics. This situation exposed how quickly those alliances can become liabilities when private disputes go public. Media coverage amplified everything. Headlines framed the story as a major rift. Commentators debated who held the moral high ground, and reaction videos flooded platforms. Each interpretation added another layer to the narrative, sometimes blurring the line between fact and speculation. With every new take, the story drifted further from its origin and deeper into the realm of cultural debate. It wasn't just about what Pooh Shiesty said. It was about what people believed it represented. Gucci Mane's legacy complicated the situation further. For many fans, he symbolized growth, redemption, and resilience. Challenging that image was bound to trigger defensive reactions. Supporters argued that his track record spoke for itself, that one artist's frustration couldn't erase years of influence and mentorship. This divide created a sharp split in the fan base, turning discussions into heated arguments about accountability versus respect and truth versus loyalty. As days passed, anticipation grew heavier. People sensed that something had to give. Either a response would come, or the silence would solidify into a statement of its own. Pooh Shiesty, having already broken the seal, seemed resolute. There was no walking back what had been said. The exposure had taken on a life of its own, reshaping perceptions and forcing uncomfortable conversations. By the end of Part 2, the fallout had clearly moved beyond shock and into consequence. Reputations were being questioned, alliances felt unstable, and the industry itself seemed uneasy. This wasn't a moment that would fade quietly. Whether through a direct response, further revelations, or prolonged standoff, the tension was set to escalate. And everyone watching knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next would define how this story was remembered. As the fallout deepened, a noticeable shift occurred in how people talked about the situation. The shock phase had passed. Now, the focus turned to motive. Why now? Why speak out at this particular moment? Fans and commentators began questioning whether Pooh Shiesty's exposure was driven by long-simmering frustration, strategic timing, or a breaking point caused by events that hadn't yet surfaced publicly. That uncertainty only made the story heavier. When motives are unclear, people assume there's more beneath the surface, and that assumption kept the tension alive. Pooh Shiesty's posture remained steady. He didn't backtrack, didn't soften his tone, and didn't attempt to reframe what had already been said. That consistency made his message feel intentional rather than emotional. To many observers, it signaled that he had accepted whatever consequences might follow. In an industry where silence is often safer, his decision to stand firm suggested that he believed the truth mattered more than optics. That belief resonated strongly with fans who felt artists are too often pressured to stay quiet for the sake of maintaining access and favor. At the same time, the absence of a direct response from Gucci Mane began to reshape perception. Silence, once viewed as strategic, slowly started to feel like a vacuum that others were eager to fill. Speculation intensified. Some interpreted the lack of response as confidence, a belief that the situation didn't deserve acknowledgement. Others saw it as hesitation, a sign that responding might risk validating claims that were better left unaddressed. With every passing day, the narrative hardened without any intervention to redirect it. Behind closed doors, the industry mood reportedly grew tense. Managers, label executives, and collaborators became cautious about public association, knowing that even a casual comment could be misinterpreted as taking sides. This caution revealed how fragile industry relationships can be when controversy enters the picture. People weren't just watching the conflict, they were calculating risk. That atmosphere made the fallout feel less like drama and more like a warning about how quickly power dynamics can shift when narratives escape private control. The fanbase remained deeply divided. One side argued that loyalty should outweigh public airing of grievances, especially when history and opportunity were involved. The other side insisted that loyalty loses meaning when it demands silence in the face of mistreatment. This philosophical split fueled endless debate, turning the situation into a larger conversation about respect, autonomy, and accountability. The argument was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about what artists owe each other and what they owe themselves. As discussions intensified, other artists' experiences began surfacing in indirect ways. Without naming names, fans started pointing out similar patterns in past industry conflicts, drawing parallels that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. That comparison gave Pooh Shiesty's exposure additional weight. It made his words feel less like a personal complaint and more like part of a recurring cycle that artists often endure quietly. Whether intentional or not, his actions had cracked open a conversation the industry rarely addresses publicly. The pressure creep, that internal conflict made the fallout feel serious, not sensational. This wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about confronting complexity in a culture that often prefers clear heroes and villains. As Part 3 closed, the situation reached a critical emotional standstill. Pooh Shiesty had spoken and stood by his words. Gucci Mane remained silent, allowing interpretation to run free. The industry watched cautiously, unwilling to intervene. Fans debated fiercely, each side convinced the stakes were bigger than one disagreement. What had started as exposure now felt like a turning point, not because of what had been proven, but because of what had been questioned. Power, loyalty, and control were no longer abstract ideas. They were at the center of the conversation. And with tensions still unresolved, one thing was certain. The longer this silence and speculation continued, the harder it would be for anyone involved to control how the story ultimately ended. By the time the situation reached this stage, the conversation had shifted again, this time toward consequence. Not legal consequence, not public punishment, but reputational gravity. People began to understand that regardless of who spoke next, nothing would return to how it was before. The exposure had already done its work. It had forced fans, insiders, and even casual observers to reconsider long-held assumptions about how power moves behind the scenes. And once those questions exist, they don't disappear easily. Pooh Shiesty's stance remained unchanged, but his silence now carried weight of its own. He had said what he needed to say, and instead of continuing to push, he let the reaction speak for itself. That restraint was read by many as confidence. He wasn't trying to dominate the narrative anymore. He was letting it unfold. In a strange way, that made his original message feel stronger. The lack of follow-up suggested that this wasn't about dragging someone publicly. It was about drawing a boundary and refusing to stay quiet past it. Within the industry, quiet recalibrations were happening. Conversations about contracts, mentorship, and control grew more cautious. Younger artists paid closer attention to how deals were structured and how loyalty was defined. Veterans, meanwhile, were reminded that influence comes with scrutiny, especially when relationships with emerging talent are involved. No one said this publicly, but the shift was noticeable. This situation had become a case study, an unspoken reference point for how quickly narratives can change when internal tensions become visible. Gucci Mane's continued silence began to feel intentional rather than uncertain. For some, it reinforced the idea that responding would only elevate the exposure further. For others, it created frustration. Fans wanted clarity, not because they demanded explanations, but because ambiguity invites imagination, and imagination often fills gaps in unflattering ways. The longer there was no response, the more people speculated about what wasn't being said. Silence, once a shield, had started to reflect too many unanswered questions. Media coverage adapted accordingly. Instead of focusing on the initial exposure, discussions shifted toward impact. Commentators debated what this meant for mentorship culture in hip-hop, for the expectations placed on artists, and for how loyalty is negotiated when money and visibility are involved. The story was no longer framed as conflict, it was framed as reflection. That reframing made it more uncomfortable because it suggested the issue wasn't isolated. It hinted at patterns rather than personalities. Fans, too, evolved in their reactions. The loud arguments softened into deeper discussions. People began acknowledging nuance, admitting that two things could be true at once, that Gucci Mane's influence and legacy are real, and that Pooh Shiesty's frustration could also be valid. That balance didn't resolve the situation, but it changed the tone. Instead of choosing sides, many began questioning the structure itself, how expectations are set, how silence is rewarded, and how speaking up is often treated as betrayal rather than honesty. Behind the scenes, speculation grew about whether any reconciliation was possible. Some believe private conversations could still reset the relationship, even if the public never saw it. Others argue that once trust fractures publicly, it rarely repairs cleanly. The exposure had already reshaped perception, and perception is difficult to reverse. Even if nothing more was said, the idea that something was unresolved would linger, shaping how future moves were interpreted. What made this phase particularly tense was the absence of escalation. No back and forth, no dramatic responses. Just wait. The kind that settles slowly and changes the atmosphere without announcing itself. That quiet heaviness suggested maturity on one side, caution on the other, and uncertainty everywhere in between. The industry wasn't holding its breath for a diss or a statement anymore. It was watching to see what this moment would change long-term. As Part 4 closed, the situation stood at an uneasy equilibrium. No resolution, no explosion, just a recalibration of power and perception. Pooh Shiesty had drawn a line. Gucci Mane had chosen not to cross it publicly. The industry adjusted its posture. Fans reconsidered their assumptions. The fallout was no longer about exposure. Within the broader culture, this moment sparked subtle but meaningful changes. Younger artists paid closer attention to how power operates once success enters the picture. Conversations about independence, boundaries, and self-advocacy became more common, even if they stayed behind closed doors. The situation served as a reminder that opportunity can coexist with frustration, and gratitude doesn't erase the right to speak honestly. That realization lingered long after the public discussion cooled. The industry itself absorbed the lesson quietly. Labels, managers, and executives became more cautious about how relationships were framed publicly versus privately. Mentorship began to sound less like ownership and more like partnership, at least in conversation. Whether that translated into real change remained uncertain, but the awareness was undeniable. Moments like this don't overhaul systems overnight, but they create pressure points. And pressure points, over time, lead to shifts. Fans, too, walked away changed. Many realized that hip-hop narratives are rarely simple. Loyalty isn't always clean. Power isn't always visible. And silence doesn't always mean innocence or guilt. The debate matured from outrage to reflection, and that evolution mattered. Instead of choosing heroes and villains, people began accepting complexity. That acceptance didn't resolve the story, but it gave it depth. What ultimately defined this fallout was its lack of closure. There was no final statement, no dramatic reconciliation, no public split. Just a clear sense that something had ended, and something else had begun. A chapter of unquestioned alignment closed quietly. In its place stood awareness, caution, and a redefined sense of autonomy. As the dust settled, one truth remained. Exposure doesn't always destroy, it reveals. And once something is revealed, it can't be unseen. Pooh Shiesty's words didn't just affect one relationship. They echoed outward, touching conversations that had long stayed hidden. The fallout was serious not because it was loud, but because it lasted. And in hip-hop, where legacy is built not just on music but on movement, moments like this don't disappear. They wait, they resurface, and they quietly shape what comes next. This situation goes way deeper than rap beef, and the fallout is still unfolding. Pooh Shiesty speaking out has forced fans and the industry to look at power, loyalty, and silence in a completely different way. Whether you agree with him or not, one thing is clear. This moment changed how people see relationships behind the scenes in hip-hop. And with Gucci Mane staying silent, the questions aren't going away anytime soon. If you're locked in on this story, hit the like button to support real discussions in hip-hop and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Turn on notifications because any new move could flip the narrative instantly. Drop a comment below and tell us how you see it. Was this overdue honesty, or should some things stay private? Share this video with a friend who follows the culture, because this conversation is far from over.